Our next speaker was an investigator with the Federal Aviation Administration. And his job was to investigate things, wrongdoings very often, to make sure things are done right. And he found a lot of stuff in FAA that he didn't like, that he investigated. And that led him to a most incredible story about not only corruption in the Federal Aviation Administration, but also corruption in many other federal governmental agencies like the CIA. You heard about CIA drug running? Well, don't believe me. Let the speaker that we're going to bring for you tell you all about that. You heard about judicial corruption? Don't believe me. Let our speaker tell you all about that. He's a hero in my book. He's a personal friend of mine. I'm very proud and very fortunate to have a great man of his character and integrity and courage to stand up for freedom, for the truth and justice. Please help me give a warm hand of welcome to Mr. Rodney Stitch.
Boy, with a welcome like that, I just soon you keep talking. But okay, the subject this period is going to be corruption in the federal government. That's a Trojan horse type of corruption that I initially discovered when I was a federal aviation safety agent. Now, part of the information I'll be presenting to you is not only what I discovered and documented, and the efforts I made trying to expose it and what was done to silence me, but it's also information that I have received during the last 20 years from other government agents, and I'm talking about FBI, CIA, ONI, former drug smugglers working for the government in drug smuggling assignments, and former mafia figures. Now, these people have come to me over a period of years after they heard about my activist activities. And these activities included publishing books, the first of which came out in 1978, and also my appearances on radio and television shows throughout the country. And up to, at this time, I've been on over 3,000 of them. One of the early ones I was on was with Anthony Hilder while he was in Anchorage, and we had a few interesting experiences at that time. But anyhow, some of the people who provided me information would be, let's see, like, for instance, mafia figures who told me the details of how the agents of the FBI, for instance, or CIA were working with organized crime. And like in the New York City area, for instance, they were providing me information of how FBI agents were giving the names of government informants and other confidential information to organized crime, and these informants would be subsequently murdered. Now, this is similar to what was happening in Boston, where about 2 or 3 years ago, there was considerable media publicity, plus congressional hearings concerning the practice of FBI agents giving the names of government informants and similar crimes to the Bulger crime family, and then the informants would be murdered. Now, this occurred during about a 25-year period when FBI Director Hoover and others knew what was going on and kept a lid on it. So this gives you a little idea of the mentality in some of the government offices. I've always said that the Justice Department, or the people in the Justice Department, constitutes really the greatest source of harm to the American people, far more than the terrorists from outside are. inflicting upon the United States. Another source of mine operated a CIA airline. And over a period of years, he's given me the details of how the CIA funded the operation, some of the drug smuggling activities, some of the other CIA airlines that were involved with these activities. And then I have other sources. For instance, the one source was explaining to me how he discovered in his position about the nuclear suitcase nuclear devices being smuggled out of the Soviet Union. This was given to me about 4 or 5 years ago, and how these things, of course, are now out there ready to be used, and I'm sure they will be used one of these days. And another source, and I'm just giving you examples, another source was the head of a secret CIA operation based in Honolulu. And matter of fact, he lives here in Los Angeles now, but he provided me boxes of CIA documents describing the operation. The operation had its cover exposed or blown back in the mid-1980s, and this had worldwide publicity at the time it happened, except in the United States, where the media pretty much kept the lid on it. But one of the interesting things I found in these boxes, and now this fellow's name is Ron Rewald, but Rewald was very hesitant about giving me details. He just wanted to forget it because he suffered quite a bit of retaliation. But one of the things I found, and then he went into details after I asked him about it, were the names of 5 different well-known politicians that were receiving funds from the CIA. And two of these people are in the media almost every day. So if something like that is going on, obviously that's a very sensitive matter. There's such a large area that I covered in my books. Incidentally, the various books I have, the first one I came out with was Unfriendly Skies. That came out in 1978. It's now in the 3rd and 4th edition. That goes into the details and documents the corruption in the government's aviation safety offices, and that includes the political National Transportation Safety Board that oftentimes covers up for the real sensitive areas behind some of the major air disasters. And it would help to explain why the NTSB covered up for the downing of Pan Am flight, or TWA Flight 800 and American Airlines Flight 587 that happened shortly after 9/11. But I think what I'll do is start giving you a little detail on how I discovered this material and some of the things I did to try to expose it, including a recent lawsuit in the Federal District Court in New York City, where I recently gave oral arguments before the Court of Appeals. And then I will, at the end of the period, give you my interpretation on 9/11. On 9/11, I won't go into the areas that the previous speakers have dwelt upon. What I'll focus on is the misconduct that was responsible for the conditions that enabled terrorists to seize 4 airliners. Now that hasn't been addressed at all by the 9/11 Commission, and they carefully avoided that, even though I offered to testify concerning my knowledge of it, and because of my background, I was probably one of the most competent people to talk on the subject. But anyhow, let me start first, give you a little background on where I come from, and then I'll go into how I discovered the material and then what I did to try to expose it. First, I was in the Navy a year before Pearl Harbor, and I was a naval aviator during World War II. Matter of fact, George Bush Sr. and I got our Navy wings at the same time. I was a patrol plane commander on Liberators and Privateers in World War II, and also a flight instructor on the PBY Catalina flying boats. After the war, I became an airline pilot for many years, and a lot of the flying was domestic and overseas. Matter of fact, the Saturday Evening Post referred to the primary airline I flew for as the daring young men of Transocean Airlines. In those days, international flying was very primitive, and you were really pioneers in doing it. And we had a very varied type of flying. Now, I flew everything from DC-3s up through the Boeing Stratos and Super Connies and then several of the jets. But one of the interesting experiences I had was flying Muslim pilgrims to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And this was in the early 50s. And all the cities that are now in the media, I've been there: Baghdad, Jerusalem, Tehran. I lived with the natives, and they were very friendly in those days. But of course, we kind of screwed that up. But one of the interesting things that I encountered was one of the early stages of how the United States or the White House politicians will rearrange foreign governments. And this was in Iran. I was there the morning that there was a revolution. Well, I didn't recognize it at that time as being a White House-inspired revolution carried out by the CIA. This was when Mossadegh was being overthrown and the Shah was put in its place. Well, when this was going on, because the few of us that were there, the Americans, the English had been thrown out and the Americans had followed. So we were due to some problems there. And so the few crew members that were flying the pilgrims, there was only a few of us. So when this was going on, and of course we couldn't understand the language, finally some European who was in charge of security came up and suggested that we depart, and they would give us a machine gun escort out to our plane, which took us, I think, about 5 minutes to pack. But anyhow, I eventually left the flying game. And, I left out one little interesting thing. I was also one of the first pilots licensed by Japan, and I was one of the first pilots for Japan Airlines. And in those days, all my co-pilots were former Japanese military pilots who a few years earlier were used to shoot at each other. So it's kind of interesting the way world affairs turns. But anyhow, I finally went with the Federal Aviation Administration, and my job was anything involving aviation safety with the airlines, and that included conducting flight checks of airline pilots, issuing ratings, looking for safety violations, safety problems, and making reports on how to prevent airline crashes. And among my many reports was how to prevent hijackings, which was very easy to prevent. And this is an area that hasn't been looked at yet. But anyhow, I had the position for a while of having the hands-on safety responsibilities for the most senior program at the world's largest airline at that time, and that was United Airlines. And in that position, the FAA came to me one day, and this is when I was here in Los Angeles, signed to the Los Angeles office. And they asked me to volunteer for an assignment to correct, which was at that time the worst series of airline crashes in the nation's history. Most people don't realize that in those days, and this is in the 50s and 60s, we were having a major airline crash about every 3 months. And these were all easily preventable. But I still remember what they told me here in Los Angeles. Rod, we have a serious problem here, but we're right behind you. Well, they were correct on the first, but let me tell you, they were not correct on the second, because when you confront problems like this, everybody runs like cockroaches to the corners. So anyhow, I took the assignment, and it didn't take me long to find out what the problems were. And these were serious problems: arrogance, corruption in the FAA, and in certain areas. And these problems still exist. And these are the conditions that prevented the federal government from ordering the simple, inexpensive preventative measures to prevent hijackings. Now, if they were to look at that, it wouldn't be simply an oversight, but they would go into all of the corruption that I made quite a record to document that existed, that was responsible for many airline crashes. And the events of 9/11 was simply one day's consequence in a long series of airline disasters that were easily preventable. At any rate, anyhow, being blocked from carrying out my job assignments, I felt I had to do something. I mean, when we're talking about airline crashes, we're talking about men, women, and children being cremated alive or dismembered alive. So there's a little incentive to get out to fight the system, even though if it means that may be the end of your career. So anyhow, I did something. I used the law in such a way that's never been used before and probably never again will be. But I became an independent prosecutor. And that lasted for about 4 months. I conducted hearings. There was a court reporter, the administrative law judge. There was 4,000 pages of hearing transcript. And during this period, I was able to pretty much prove the existence between the deep-seated misconduct in the FAA and a series of specific airline crashes. Matter of fact, there were three crashes that happened during the hearing, 2 of which happened in my immediate area of responsibilities. And if I was writing the script to show the relationship, I couldn't have done any better. One of these was a crash at Salt Lake City in which 43 people were cremated alive. Anyhow, I submitted the closing brief, and in that, and the closing brief, incidentally, you can find it on my website, Defrauding America, along with a lot of other material. But I warned that if you cover up for this, we're going to have a continuation. Well, during all this time, I'm contacting members of Congress, some of whom admitted the seriousness of what I was saying, but said, hey, this isn't in my area, their area of responsibilities. Well, and Justice Department personnel, that was the beginning of finding out the blockage, the obstruction of justice by people in the Justice Department when it comes to government corruption. I even had to circumvent the Justice Department to go to a federal grand jury in Denver. Things were very serious for me to go to this extent because having been an airline pilot for many, many years and a non-sched pilot for a while, I can tolerate some irregularities, but this was a little too much. But anyhow, it was a cover-up. So I sent a letter to the FAA saying I refused to work under these conditions, and I left. Well, I stayed active in aviation. I was one of the founding members of the Society of Air Safety Investigators. And the crashes then continued, and it got worse because planes got bigger. So I felt, well, let's see, what can I do about this? I have the evidence. I'm one of the few people willing to speak out. So how am I going to handle this? So I thought, well, I'll use the law in creative manner. And what I use would be of interest to probably many of you here. One is the Federal Crime Reporting Statute, and that's 18 U.S.C. Section 4, and that says anyone who knows of a federal crime must report it to a federal judge or the federal officers. So I said, well, I tried Congress, they refused to receive it. Justice Department refuses to receive it. I'll report it to a federal judge, and at least I make a record of it. So I filed the first action in the federal court in San Francisco against the FAA. And the first thing the Justice Department did was file a motion to dismiss, claiming I lacked standing. Everybody's got standing if you know of a federal crime, and if you don't report it, you may join one of the thousands who have been sent to prison. I remember this little black gal that I report and I write about in one of my books who overheard one side of a drug conversation. She didn't report it. So the Justice Department and federal judges sentenced this gal to 5 years in federal prison for not reporting it. So now I'm reporting criminal activities that are far worse. And what do I run into? I find obstruction of justice by the Justice Department personnel and the federal judge. The judge at that time was Judge Snarky. Well, I filed an appeal, and during oral arguments, I remember one of the judges saying, well, Mr. Stitch, these are serious charges. This is up to Congress to investigate. I said, this I know, but they refused to. But you have the responsibility to at least receive it, and this is carefully stated in the crime reporting statute as part of your administrative duties. Well, that didn't get anywhere. So what I did then, I submitted what we call a petition for writ of certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they received it. And now the Supreme Court justices had evidence of obstruction of justice by judges over whom they have supervisory responsibility. Also, they had the responsibility to receive my information, and they refused to do anything about it. So that was the start of a long series of involvement by the justices of the Supreme Court, and that goes right up to what's going on today. But anyhow, the next action was against the NTSB, and I was seeking a court order requiring the political board members of the NTSB to receive evidence that I had that was material to several major air disasters. The most recent at that time was the PSA San Diego crash, which I write about in my book. Well, shortly after I filed it, the assistant U.S. attorney in San Francisco, George Stoll, he called me one day and he said he was recommending to his superiors in Washington that they support my action. Well, he didn't know that the Justice Department personnel in Washington already had a history of covering up, and the last they wanted was to get anything to come to the surface. Well, a week later, George Stoll is filing a motion to dismiss, claiming I lack standing, and that was approved, and so I argued it up to the Court of Appeals, and that didn't get anywhere. So I again went to the Supreme Court, so they again were on notice of what was going on, and they didn't do anything about it. So then I thought, well, let's see, what can I do next? The public. Surely they want to know, especially the next of kin. I used to believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny too, so you'll have to excuse me there. So at any rate, I start writing books. And the first one was in 1978, and that was Unfriendly Skies. And I started getting on radio and television shows. And in those days, I was one of the first, I hate to use the word whistleblower, I don't like that term, but anyhow, I was one of the first ones trying to expose corruption in government. So I was on lots of shows. Up to date, I've been on over 3,000 of them. Anthony Hilder was one of the first ones who helped spread the message. Here in Los Angeles, after the PSA San Diego crash, I was on 6 and 8 shows a day, and oftentimes on Ray Breen from midnight to 6 in the morning. And then at 9 o'clock in the morning, I would be scheduled for other shows. Those were in my younger days. I couldn't do that today anymore. But anyhow, while I got a lot of good letters from people, nobody would do anything. But it did accomplish one thing. Other government agents started coming to me. And these were agents, I mean, they're talking facts. And this is corruption and subversive activities. I mean, like drug smuggling by the CIA, that's subversive. So they're coming to me and giving me this information. And this was really, I mean, I was finding out things that earlier I don't believe somebody was paranoid tell me these things. But this was right from the horse's mouth. And I remember one of the first was October Surprise. And this was one of the first CIA guys was a fellow by the name of Gunther Rusbacher. And he and I spent hundreds of hours, me taping his experiences. But anyhow, he was a little reluctant to tell me about this, but one night around midnight, I got a call from him. Apparently there was an assassination attempt on him in Monterey where a helicopter went down. I said, okay, Gunther, look, call me in the morning and give me a declaration which I will record, and I'll start publicizing it on just what happened in October Surprise. Well, October Surprise, incidentally, was a scheme in which some American hostages had been seized by Iran, and this is one of the blowback effects of the invasion of the revolution in Iran. But anyhow, Iranians finally threw out the CIA puppet. And with that, shortly thereafter, they seized 52 American hostages. Well, this is when and Jimmy Carter was coming up for re-election, and it was felt that if the hostages were released, that Carter might be re-elected. So anyhow, there were secret meetings held in several places in Europe, and Rusbacher was there, and he's describing the details, who was there and what have you. That's also described in one of my books, Defrauding America. But anyhow, so I thought, well, fine, I'll report this to, I'll file another action to report it. So I file an action in Sacramento federal courts, and Judge Milton Schwartz was the judge on this one. And during the first hearing, Milton Schwartz said, Mr. Stitch, these are serious charges. You've got to get a lawyer. I'm going to give you time to get in a lawyer. Well, first of all, I didn't need a lawyer to report what the corruption that I was finding out. Well, of course, over a period of years, attorneys said, look, if I represent you, that's the end of my career. And so anyhow, about a week later, someone must have contacted Judge Schwartz, and he issued an order violating due process, not only dismissing the action, which of course obstructs justice, but also issuing an order permanently barring me the right to file any papers in any federal district or appellate court. Well, that's somewhat unconstitutional, but that order had been repeated now about 7 times. And judges from Judge Sporkin, the former CIA counsel, and others have issued similar orders keeping me from filing any papers in federal court. So in a way, I'm literally a man without a country insofar as defending myself and my legal rights. Anyhow, over a period of time, I'm starting to hear about the drug smuggling. And I feel, well, these are serious matters. It's not just a crime. These are subversive activities. So I file another action in Sacramento. Well, this wasn't greeted too well. U.S. Attorney David Levi charged me with criminal contempt of court, and Judge Swartz went along with that. And criminal contempt of court, well, because I was barred from, for the rest of my life from filing any papers in court. Well, okay, so I paid $25,000 to lawyer Joel Pegg, who promptly sabotaged me, which is not unusual. And so I'm denied a jury trial, so it's pretty much of a kangaroo court. So what happens? I'm sentenced to federal court. At the age of 70, after having multiple bypass surgery, I'm now going to federal prison for 6 months. And the way they did it, believe me, they made it rough. They wanted to send a message to me. So try traveling around and change for a while from town to town. So while I'm in prison, then orders are rendered seizing all my assets. And at that time, what started out as a $400 investment was now about $10 million in real estate assets, and that's what funded my rather ridiculous activist activities. And I guess they figure, well, with no assets, this is the end of my exposure activities. So anyhow, and here, of course, orders that are issued without due process are void and can be attacked at any time. But anyhow, I filed an objection to that, and the objection was unfiled, and then I'm charged with criminal contempt of court again. So from about 1986 to about 1995, I'm either in federal prison or under literal house arrest, which I'm thinking to myself, this is a hell of a way to try to protect national interest. But anyhow, over a period of time, my lifestyle did change a little bit. So I'm leaving out on some of the other things, but about a year before 9/11, I figured, well, I'm going to try just once more to file a federal action. Well, I couldn't file it in California because they have me in their computer. Don't let this guy file any papers. So I figured I'll outfox him. I went to Reno and filed. Well, you can't outfox those guys because then the Judge Reed was the judge there. He refused to receive the information. Any information I'm trying to present is partly due to the corruption in the FAA and also the cover-ups by the political board members of the NTSB. And of course, by this time, I'm trying to report a number of other areas, not only the drug smuggling, but in the books, as you'll see, there's many other areas of corruption. And so they blocked that and ordered me to pay several $1,000s in sanctions, try and collect. But so I figured, well, that's it. That's the end of that. There's nothing much more I can do. I'll just keep writing books and make them available as an e-book to download, and maybe someone somewhere will start paying attention. Well, 9/11 happens. I go, oh my goodness, this is great for me. I mean, it's tragic, but it's great to get them finally connect the dots. So I I submit for filing a complaint in the federal district courts in New York, where most of the 9/11 litigation is going on. Well, they never file it. They get it in the proper order. The filing fee is paid. They must file it, but they don't. So I sent letters to each of the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court advising them that of the latest attempts, the latest actions, the latest obstruction of justice by judges over whom they had supervisory responsibilities. Well, then they file it. But then instantaneously or within a few minutes, they file a 5-page dismissal order. Well, Judge, how can you prepare a 5-page dismissal order in a few minutes? So anyhow, so they dismiss it. They claim these were frivolous allegations. Tell that to the people jumping out of the World Trade Center. But nevertheless, I then filed an appeal, and I was scheduled and appeared to give oral arguments in the Court of Appeals in New York at Foley Square. And that was kind of interesting, and I write about that in one of my e-books. And then of course, then they have to cover up now because it's such a scandal in the federal courts. And of course, if the public found out about all of these other things, I mean, we've got a major, major crisis here. So anyhow, I submit papers to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they refuse to file it. Now, they've done that before, claiming that the double spacing doesn't quite meet their criteria, or that it's been filed too late when it's not filed too late. But at any rate, that's where we are now. And there's a lot of information you can all learn about this. Because remember, there's a lot of people that have taken great risk to get this information available to you. If you go to defraudingamerica.com website, there's a lot of heavy stuff on there. Oh, on 9/11, I only have about 2 or 3 minutes left. 9/11, all of the attention has been addressed to intelligence failures, failures to act on intelligence. Those are innocent things, but they avoid the main area of blame, the FAA, because it's the FAA that has the authority and the responsibility to prevent hijacking. They got into the cockpit with a key. There's no evidence that they broke down any doors. Doors can be broke down, but as the average pilot, someone's pounding the door back there, you're going to put it in an unusual attitude to where that guy's standing on his head or doing something else. So how do they get the keys? From the flight attendants? And I had reported in the past, when I was an FAA investigator, that's one of the first things we got to do, eliminate the keys from the flight attendants. And it could have been done in 24 hours notice. But the type of mentality we have in government today, they just would not do it. But if they had addressed that, then they've got all these records. You've got my 4,000-page hearing transcript while I was in the FAA, where I warned about these things, and there's a lot of documentation there. There's all of the court actions I filed, and of course, all of this is documented. It's not wild allegations. And if the public would ever look at that, what they would find is some terrible conditions that I doubt hardly anyone here recognizes just how bad it is. And it's bad. And I'm not optimistic because I've been on many shows. I've been here, and very few people read about these things. So as long as that continues, it's going to, the problems are going to continue, and you're all going to pay the consequences. Thank you.